Hey guys, tonight we settle into a story that is both unsettling and strangely hypnotic, the kind of history that feels more dreamlike than real, even though it absolutely happened. Imagine yourself walking across a quiet field at dusk. The air smells faintly of hay and wood smoke, and the world is soft enough that you could almost believe nothing dangerous could exist here. But beneath that fading glow of rural calm, a girl was growing up who would later become known to the world as the Hyena of Auschwitz. And you, drifting along this path with me, are about to step into her life. You probably won't survive this particular journey, at least not if you had the misfortune of being there in person, but don't worry, in this space you're safe, wrapped in a cocoon of distance, with nothing to fear except maybe dozing off too soon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is glowing on your clock? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge a little deeper into that German countryside, the year somewhere around 1930. The roads are simple dirt tracks, and the air carries the faint tang of manure because, well, farms never hide their perfume. Irma Ilse Grese is about 7 years old here, a thin, sharp-faced child with restless eyes. Her family works the land, and life is modest, even harsh. She doesn't grow up in a glamorous mansion, but in a kind of rural setting where chores dominate and school feels like a distant afterthought. Her father is strict, the kind of man who thinks feelings are less useful than a strong back and a willingness to work. The curious thing is that when you picture her here, chasing chickens or dragging buckets, you don't see a monster. You see just another farm girl. And that's where the unease begins. Because history often doesn't give us villains born in shadows, it gives us ordinary people who, step by step, walk into something unthinkable. Historians still argue whether Irma was driven by ideology, by peer pressure, or simply by a hunger for power in a world that offered her very few choices. On the farm, she was known for being a bit dreamy, the sort of girl who longed for more than mucking out cow sheets. One quirky little tidbit that historians love to mention is that Irma once told classmates she wanted to be a nurse, inspired by glamorous posters of young women in crisp white uniforms. Imagine the irony, a girl daydreaming about helping the sick, while fate was nudging her toward becoming infamous for cruelty. If life had twisted differently, perhaps you'd never have heard her name. But life didn't twist differently. By her mid-teens, Irma's home life had grown more unbearable. Her mother had died when she was just a child, and that left the household with a chill that never really lifted. Losing a mother young leaves gaps you can't easily patch, and perhaps part of Irma's later hunger for authority came from that early loss, the way children sometimes seek to claw back control over the chaos that blindsided them. But don't get too caught up in sympathy, our story isn't headed for comfort. Picture yourself in that kitchen, rough-hewn wood, a stove radiating faint warmth, bread crusts left on a chipped plate. You hear the father's boots thud across the floor. He's not an affectionate man, he doesn't tell stories at bedtime or laugh at spilled milk. Instead, he keeps discipline sharp as the farm tools hanging by the door. Irma grows up with a strange cocktail of obedience and defiance. She dreams, but she also obeys, and those two currents tug at her as the 1930s bleed into the Nazi era. Germany itself, meanwhile, is shifting beneath everyone's feet. You can almost hear the distant speeches on radios in village taverns, Hitler promising renewal, strength, pride. Farmers who once muttered about hard times now murmur about hope. And in such a climate, a restless girl might look at the wider world and think, maybe there's a place for me out there, beyond cows and fields. It's here that the seeds are planted. She is not yet the hyena, not yet even a guard. She's simply a teenager staring out at the horizon, frustrated and ambitious in her own narrow way. One could almost feel the ground vibrating faintly, as if the future itself were whispering that her path would lead far from this sleepy farm. You glance around the room, notice the shadows pooling in the corners, and feel that faint pinch of dread. And maybe you ask yourself, how does a child with ordinary beginnings drift so far from ordinary? The answer, as we'll see, is not simple. Even now, historians debate whether Irma was swept along by forces too big for her, or whether she sprinted toward cruelty with open arms. That debate will follow us all the way to her final day. For now, let the barn lanterns flicker, let the cows shuffle in their stalls, and let that young girl's eyes wander towards something that feels like destiny. You're walking beside her still, though the road ahead is getting darker. You leave the farmyard behind, boots crunching along the rutted path, as Irma's world begins to stretch a little wider. She is a teenager now, moving through the early 1930s, when Germany itself is caught in its awkward adolescence. The Great Depression has already left its mark, jobs scarce, futures uncertain, hopes as fragile as glass. And here is Irma, caught between the barn smell of her daily chores and the bigger questions she can't quite answer. What kind of life could she possibly have? Her family, still marked by her mother's absence, doesn't make things easier. The house feels cold even when the stove glows red. Her father's discipline is still relentless, his affections tightly bolted shut. You glance at Irma as she brushes dust from her work dress, and you can sense that tug-of-war inside her, the desire to please her father, balanced against a yearning to escape his shadow. You've probably felt that yourself, standing at some window, teenage heart thudding, thinking surely there's more than this. And in Germany of that era, escape routes weren't exactly abundant. For girls from rural families, options looked depressingly narrow: marry young, work in a factory, or maybe, if you were lucky, find training in some practical trade. Irma wanted none of those. She once announced, with almost comical stubbornness, that she would become a film star, though she had neither the connections nor the training. Historians still argue whether that claim was just youthful fantasy or a hint at her craving for recognition, the kind of attention she later grabbed in much darker ways. But there was one idea that stuck with her longer: nursing. Posters from the time, showing fresh-faced young women in crisp uniforms, promised dignity, pride, and a role in the rebuilding of Germany. Irma tried to pursue that path. She applied to nursing school but was rejected, perhaps for lack of qualifications, perhaps for reasons lost in bureaucratic dust. Either way, rejection was a blow. Imagine her, walking home down a lane lined with hedges, hands shoved in pockets, the weight of disappointment pressing heavier than her wooden clogs. That rejection was a fork in the road, though she couldn't know it then. She still wanted more than the farm, still believed she deserved some measure of importance. And as the Nazi state tightened its grip on daily life, opportunities began appearing for young Germans who were willing to serve the new order. Irma, restless and perhaps resentful, started gravitating toward those uniforms, those promises of belonging. She worked briefly as a dairy helper, slogging through early mornings and heavy pails, but she never truly settled into it. She was 17, caught in that itchy stage where everything feels too small, too dull. The world seemed to whisper, "There's something bigger out there, waiting for you." Now, here's one quirky detail: her neighbors remembered her as quiet, even timid, sometimes awkward. Not the kind of girl who commanded a room. She wasn't a natural leader in those days. And yet, only a few years later, prisoners would tremble at her footsteps. The transformation was swift, unsettling, and maybe the scariest part of her story: how quickly a timid farm girl could learn to wield cruelty like a weapon. For now, you walk beside her down those farm lanes, listening to the distant hum of radios in town centers where Nazi rallies are broadcast. The words are fiery, the promises intoxicating. Young people are told they are the future, the pride of the nation. And when you're 17, with little else to hold on to, that message can feel like destiny. Irma clings to it. Whether from genuine belief or sheer hunger for purpose, she edges closer to the system that would soon consume her life. Picture her staring into a cracked mirror, braiding her hair neatly, practicing the stiff poise of a uniform she hasn't yet earned. She doesn't look like the hyena of Auschwitz in this reflection, just another teenager imagining herself into someone else's life. And you can't help but feel a chill as you realize, history is full of crossroads like this, moments where one rejection, one choice, sets someone on a path that will ripple into thousands of lives. If Irma had been accepted to that nursing school, maybe she'd have lived out her days handing out aspirin in some quiet clinic. But instead, her rejection and her restless ambition pushed her toward the SS, and the story you're drifting through now begins to tighten its grip. So you walk with her a little further, toward a horizon that smells less of hay and more of iron and smoke. The innocence of farm chores is fading, and the edges of something darker begin to show. The lanes of the village grow quieter behind you, and ahead lies the unmistakable clang of boots on pavement, the bark of orders carried on chilly morning air. Irma is 18 now, teetering on the edge of adulthood, and she makes the leap that will change everything. She joins the SS Auxiliary Service. You watch her step into a new world, trading the rough apron of a farm girl for the stiff fabric of a uniform. The cloth is scratchy, the cut severe, but to her it feels like transformation. Suddenly, she's no longer invisible. She belongs to something larger. The process is brisk, bureaucratic, almost boring at first. Papers signed, photographs snapped, forms stamped with the eagle crest. But boredom gives way to the heavy weight of reality. She is sent to barracks where young women are trained as SS helpers, their days filled with drill and discipline. You can almost smell the starch in the sheets, hear the echo of commands as they march in step across a gravel yard. It's here, trudging through drills under the cold gaze of instructors, that Irma's sense of self begins to bend. Imagine her gripping the strap of her rifle, practicing salute after salute, while being told that obedience is the highest virtue. You've probably had a dull training session at some point, school gym class, maybe a boring job orientation, but this is that, weaponized. Day after day, repetition grinds away hesitation, until obedience feels easier than thought. Historians still argue whether Irma signed up out of pure conviction, or simply because she craved escape and status. Some suggest she was seduced by the glamour of uniformed life, the suggestion that she, too, could stand tall and command respect. Others believe she was already nursing a streak of cruelty that found fertile ground here. Whatever the motive, she was in. And here's a quirky detail: she wasn't initially posted to a death camp. Her first work was menial, guarding fences, shadowing officers, doing errands that seemed small but slowly normalized the structure of terror. She might have grumbled about the mud on her boots or the endless hours of standing, without realizing yet how far the path would pull her. You, walking just behind her, can almost feel the weight of that first rifle in her hands, not yet deadly, but brimming with possibility. Of course, the SS wasn't only about discipline. It was also about indoctrination. In those barracks, young women heard lectures laced with ideology, the talk of racial purity, the glorification of strength, the disdain for weakness. Imagine a classroom with stiff benches, chalk squeaking across a blackboard as an officer scrawls slogans. The young recruits listen, nodding, some with glazed eyes, some with fire in their expressions. Irma sits among them, absorbing, reshaping her view of the world one slogan at a time. For her, this was intoxicating. Back on the farm, she was nobody. Here, in uniform, she was somebody. The system dangled authority before her, and she reached for it. She may not yet have been cruel, but the seeds were watered daily. A neighbor back home might have remembered her as quiet, even shy, but here, the rules encouraged hardness. A joke went around the barracks that smiling too much could be mistaken for weakness. So, she practiced sternness like it was another drill. And as you march beside her across those gravel yards, you feel how easily an ordinary young woman is reshaped by her environment. A joke for you here: it's a little like putting a teenager into a gym for the first time. Before long, they start flexing in every mirror, convinced they're changing faster than they are. Irma's flexing wasn't muscles, but cruelty. And the mirror she stared into was the approving glance of her instructors. She finishes her training with a mixture of pride and nerves, then receives her first official assignment, Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp. The name alone carries a chill, though to her, at that moment, it might have sounded like nothing more than a posting. You and I, with hindsight, know exactly how far that shadow stretches. But for Irma, it was simply the next step, a destination stamped on orders she probably clutched tightly as she packed her meager belongings. As she boards the transport, boots heavy on the metal step, you can feel the finality of it. The farm girl is gone. The nursing dream is gone. What remains is a uniformed figure moving inexorably toward a role that history will never forgive. And yet, she doesn't know that. Not yet. She's still just 18, staring out a train window, watching fields blur past as she carries her restless ambition straight into darkness. The train slows with a groan, metal wheels screeching against iron rails, and you find yourself clutching the wooden bench as the countryside dissolves into barbed wire and watchtowers. Irma steps down first, her boots meeting gravel, her eyes flicking up at the looming gates of Ravensbrück. This place is not the farm, not the barracks, it's something far harsher, a world humming with discipline and despair. Here she receives what you might call her real education. Training manuals are tossed aside, now it's cruelty by apprenticeship. Senior female guards bark orders, their leather belts snapping like punctuation. Watch carefully, they tell the newcomers, and so Irma does, watching how prisoners are spoken to like cattle, how every sign of weakness in a guard is pounced on by colleagues eager to show they are tougher. You stand beside her in the yard, wind cutting across your face, realizing that here, kindness is not just discouraged, it's punished. Daily life in Ravensbrück is a rhythm of steel. Dawn roll calls drag on in the freezing cold until toes go numb. Prisoners shuffle in rows, eyes down, and Irma watches how veteran guards enforce order with casual strikes of their sticks. You probably hate long lines at the grocery store, imagine standing in one for hours, knowing the person with a clipboard could beat you for sneezing. That was the atmosphere Irma breathed in daily, and it shaped her. One quirky fact, Ravensbrück was the largest women's camp in the Nazi system, housing tens of thousands of inmates. It was meant to be orderly, at least on paper, but it became notorious for its brutality. Historians still argue whether young guards like Irma simply mirrored the behavior they saw, or whether they amplified it, trying to climb the ladder by out-crueltying the others. In either case, the effect was the same. The girl who once dreamed of nursing now stood among women learning to master power by domination. Irma begins with small tasks, escorting prisoners to work details, monitoring them in workshops, and reporting infractions. But even these mundane duties carry sharp edges. Imagine her walking behind a line of prisoners carrying heavy sacks, her boots crunching on the gravel, the occasional shout bursting from her throat to hurry them along. Each day, the authority she wields grows more intoxicating. You can sense her practicing it, like a performer perfecting a role. In the barracks at night, the guards relax, trade cigarettes, and share stories. Some complain about the troublemakers, others boast about breaking spirits. Irma, still young, soaks it all in. She wants to belong, to impress, to be seen as more than the shy farm girl who once stumbled through milking cows. Here, toughness is currency, and she's eager to spend. It's also here that the quirks of her personality begin to harden into the traits that would define her reputation later. She is vain. Proud of her appearance, careful with her hair, her boots polished sharper than most. Yet vanity collides with viciousness. Some survivors remembered her as almost movie star beautiful, others saw only the cruelty behind her eyes. It's chilling to think both views could be true at the same time, depending on which side of her smile you stood. You walk with her along the camp perimeter as a cold wind snakes through the trees. The prisoners' barracks stand silent, but you can feel the weight of suffering pressing out from their walls. Irma barely glances at them now. What once might have shocked her becomes background noise, the way you might eventually stop hearing the hum of a refrigerator. That numbness is its own kind of danger. And yet, she is not the worst here, not yet. She is still learning, still imitating. One might even say she is in rehearsal for the role that Auschwitz will demand of her. For now, she is a trainee in cruelty, carrying her whip awkwardly at her side, still uncertain when to snap it, still watching others for cues. But the direction is set. Each day here is practice for darker stages. Think of it like this: if life were a play, Irma has just finished reading her lines backstage. At Ravensbrück, she steps onto the stage for the first time. And the audience, made of thousands of suffering women, has no choice but to watch. The Ravensbrück gates swing open at dawn, and you walk through them with Irma as her apprenticeship in brutality begins to feel less like practice and more like performance. She moves now with a stiffer spine, the awkward shuffle of a new recruit replaced by something colder. The gravel crunches under her boots the same way it always has, but her gaze is sharper, her shouts more confident. Authority has settled into her like a second skin. Prisoners sense it too. At first, they might have seen her as just another young face among the guards, one still learning the ropes. But within weeks, whispers start, the blonde one is harsher now, someone mutters in the barracks. Survivors later recalled how quickly she seemed to shed hesitation, how cruelty became not just part of her job but part of her presence. And here's where you feel the uneasy shift, this isn't simply a girl following orders. This is someone beginning to enjoy the power imbalance. Daily routines grind forward with mechanical precision. Roll call at 4 a.m., hours of standing in the freezing yard, prisoners collapsing and being dragged away. You're there beside Irma as she scans the lines, eyes darting like a hawk's, barking at those who waver. Historians still argue whether this was survival behavior, her way of proving herself to older guards, or the blossoming of something darker inside her. Either way, the outcome looked the same to the people on the receiving end. And there are moments of eerie contrast. Irma, at only 19, still preens before a mirror when she can find one, fussing with her hair, smoothing her uniform. Survivors remembered how striking she could appear, with clear eyes and an almost girlish face, a bizarre counterpoint to her harshness. Quirky detail, one inmate described how she sometimes hummed to herself while pacing the yard, as if she were strolling in a park rather than overseeing forced labor. It's those unsettling contradictions that made her so memorable, even decades later. Within the camp hierarchy, she starts to climb. Not officially at first, titles and promotions come later, but socially, among the other guards. She laughs at their cruel jokes, adds her own sharp comments, and soon she's no longer the newcomer. She belongs. The camaraderie of brutality is its own glue. You can almost hear the clink of tin mugs in the staff canteen, the smoke curling from cigarettes as they gossip about prisoners as though discussing livestock. Meanwhile, prisoners learn to avoid her. Some guards could be bribed with scraps, others could be appealed to with quiet words. But Irma? The stories suggest she was unpredictable. She might glance past you one day, indifferent, and the next unleash her whip for the smallest offense. That unpredictability made her terrifying. Imagine walking past a dog that sometimes ignores you and sometimes lunges at your throat, you'd flinch every time. And yet, she is still just at the beginning. Ravensbrück is cruel, but it is not yet Auschwitz. Here, she sharpens her tools, learns the mechanics of command, and hardens herself against pity. You feel it as you walk alongside her in the yard, each day is another layer of callus forming, another barrier between human empathy and the role she is embracing. At night, she returns to the guards' quarters. The air smells of damp wool and tobacco. She props her boots by the cot, smooths her hair with a brush, maybe even jots a line in a letter home. Picture her handwriting, curling across paper, as she tells her father about her important work. The irony bites, doesn't it? A farm girl writing about important work, while outside her barracks, women huddle against hunger and cold. But to her, it's status. It's proof she has escaped the obscurity of farm life. You sit with her a moment in that dimly lit barracks, listening to the muffled laughter of other guards, the scrape of chairs on the floor. Irma doesn't know it yet, but Ravensbrück is just a stepping stone. The regime is watching, moving pieces across the board. Soon, she will be transferred to a place where her reputation will grow to monstrous proportions. The wind rattles the shutters. A whistle pierces the night. And you realize, as she does not, that this is only rehearsal. The real stage, the infamous one, is waiting. Auschwitz calls her name, and she is ready to answer. The journey to Auschwitz begins with the rattle of a train, and you ride along with Irma as the countryside unspools in blurred strips of green and gray. She doesn't look nervous. In fact, she seems almost eager, her chin tilted high, her polished boots crossed neatly at the ankles. To her, this is not exile, it's promotion. Auschwitz, the camp whispered about even among guards, meant a chance to prove herself, to rise in the hierarchy. To you, of course, with hindsight, the very name sends a shiver down your spine. The camp appears on the horizon not like a fortress, but like a vast machine, smokestacks curling with gray plumes, endless barbed wire fencing that glitters in the morning sun, towers standing silent like watchful sentries. You step down onto the gravel beside Irma, and the air feels different here, thicker, as if it carries memory. A sour tang prickles in your nose, half smoke, half something unnameable. This is Auschwitz-Birkenau, a place already infamous by 1942, though its reputation would only deepen in the years to come. Irma's transfer is handled briskly. Orders are signed, duties assigned. She's placed in the women's section, where tens of thousands of prisoners are crammed into wooden barracks. At 19, she is one of the youngest female guards, but she carries herself with the assurance of someone twice her age. Almost immediately, inmates notice her. Survivors later described her striking appearance, the neat uniform, the braided blonde hair, the icy eyes. Some whispered that she looked almost like an actress stepping onto a set. But instead of a script, she carried a whip. Your footsteps follow hers as she paces through the camp on her first days, observing routines. Prisoners stumble in lines, skeletal faces turned down. Irma watches, memorizing the rhythm, the clanging roll calls, the endless marches to work details, the smoke curling upward day and night. She learns quickly, as if she has been waiting for this stage all along. And here's a quirky tidbit: despite the horrors around her, Irma took pride in her appearance. Prisoners remembered how she always tried to look impeccable, sometimes even sunbathing during breaks, lounging like she were at a spa instead of the heart of a death camp. Imagine the jarring contrast, prisoners collapsing from starvation, while a young guard stretches in the sun with a faint smile, as though life were ordinary. It's this surreal dissonance that made her both unforgettable and terrifying. Her reputation begins to spread. She is not merely following orders now, she is enforcing them with a kind of theatrical zeal. Whispers move through the barracks, the young one, the blonde one, be careful. Some call her the beautiful beast. Others later would give her the nickname that stuck forever, the Hyena of Auschwitz. Historians still argue whether that nickname was coined by prisoners or popularized later, but its sting is undeniable. You trail her as she makes her rounds, whip coiled in one hand, boots biting into the gravel. At times she appears almost bored, but then, without warning, she lashes out at someone too slow, too weak, too human. That unpredictability becomes her signature. Fear spreads not just from what she does, but from the constant anxiety that she might do it at any moment. And yet, for Irma herself, this is success. She writes letters home about her important work, perhaps with the same earnestness she once reserved for nursing ambitions. To her family, she is rising, earning status. She has traded the dairy farm for authority, the obscurity of village life for a place where even senior officers know her name. But as you walk beside her, you can't shake the sense that she is crossing a line from which there is no return. She is no longer the apprentice at Ravensbrück. She is now fully in character, the role fitted to her like that uniform jacket she smooths down every morning. The stage is Auschwitz, and every move she makes is watched by terrified eyes. The smokestacks sigh. The gravel crunches. The sun dips low over rows of barracks. And Irma Grese, barely 20 years old, is stepping into infamy. The days at Auschwitz fall into a rhythm, though rhythm here means something grim, the metallic clang of roll call before dawn, the endless shuffling of feet as prisoners are counted, the drone of orders shouted in German, the crack of boots striking gravel. You walk with Irma Grese as she settles into this routine, and you begin to see why her name would echo through history. In her hand, she often carried a whip, sometimes plated leather, sometimes improvised from cellophane, knotted to sting like fire. Survivors said it became an extension of her arm, almost casual, the way someone might twirl a pencil. But when it struck, it left deep marks, sometimes tearing skin open. Then there were the dogs. She had a pair of large, trained hounds, beasts that obeyed her every flick of the wrist. To watch her with them was like watching a circus act twisted into something monstrous. She would set them loose on prisoners who faltered, their snarls tearing through the silence, their jaws snapping at thin legs. Some accounts claimed she laughed at the terror it caused, a laugh sharp and high-pitched, like the yipping of a hyena. It was one of the things that earned her that nickname. And yet, strangely, she was still only in her early 20s. Imagine the contradiction, a young woman, not long out of adolescence, acting with the authority of a seasoned officer, wielding cruelty like a form of theater. Some inmates later said the unpredictability was the worst part. She could pass you one day without a glance, and the next, strike you down for nothing more than a loose thread on your uniform. That kind of randomness turns fear into a permanent companion. You walk with her along the camp's long lines of prisoners, and you notice how eyes drop instantly when she appears. Nobody dares to meet her gaze. Survivors described the silence that followed her steps, as though the air itself retreated from her presence. And still, there's that bizarre image, her neat blonde hair, her polished boots, her uniform pressed without a wrinkle. She took pride in her appearance, as though it mattered to be beautiful while surrounded by misery. Here's an unsettling fact, Irma was barely 5'5", not particularly tall or imposing. But power in Auschwitz didn't come from size. It came from the uniform, the weapons, and the knowledge that she had the SS machine behind her. Fear magnified her presence until she seemed much larger than life, a figure who could silence hundreds with a glance. Stories of her cruelty spread beyond Auschwitz. Prisoners whispered to new arrivals, "Beware of the young guard with the whip." They told each other to keep their eyes down, to avoid attracting notice, to pray she was distracted. Her name became a warning passed from bunk to bunk, a shadow in every corner of the camp. And you, walking in her footsteps tonight, can almost hear it, the whips crack, the dogs growl, the hyenas laugh echoing through the gravel yards. Auschwitz was already a place of death, but in Irma Grese's presence, it became a stage of terror, ruled by a girl barely into adulthood who seemed to relish her role. You're standing now in that strange, contradictory space where beauty and terror meet, and it feels almost surreal. Imagine this, a young woman, barely in her 20s, with clear skin, bright eyes, and carefully styled hair, walking through a landscape of starvation, disease, and death. Irma Grese's looks became part of her legend. Survivors often spoke of her appearance in the same breath as her cruelty, as if the two could never be untangled. She wore her SS uniform sharply pressed, boots polished until they gleamed, and sometimes even accessorized with a hint of perfume. This wasn't just vanity, it was theater. She seemed to know the effect of the contrast, a clean, well-groomed figure standing over hollow-eyed prisoners in ragged clothes. The more immaculate she looked, the more grotesque the imbalance became. One survivor recalled that she often carried herself with a kind of strut, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She wanted to be noticed. In fact, some prisoners whispered that she thrived on their fear. That it was her fuel. And yet, that fear mixed strangely with another detail. More than a few accounts said men noticed her beauty, even in that horrific environment. It wasn't admiration, it was an unsettling awareness that her presence carried both allure and danger, like walking too close to fire. Historians still argue whether her obsession with appearance was simply youthful vanity or something deeper, a way of asserting dominance in a place where life had been stripped of all dignity. Was her lipstick an act of cruelty in itself, a reminder to the prisoners of the normal world that had been stolen from them? Or was it just a young woman clinging to her identity in the only way she knew how? The truth, as always, is hard to pin down. Here's a strange tidbit you might not expect. After the war, in her prison cell, guards and reporters noted that she continued to pay attention to her looks. She asked for skincare products, wanted to be seen as presentable. Even facing trial for war crimes, she maintained that careful grooming. It's unsettling, you'd think the weight of what she'd done might crush that concern, but instead, it seemed to persist like a stubborn habit. Imagine yourself walking past her in the camp, her perfume faint in the air, her boots clicking on the gravel, her whip coiled neatly at her side. Your stomach would twist with dread, because her beauty didn't soften the brutality. It sharpened it. Survivors said she could smile sweetly one moment and lash out violently the next. That unpredictability was her most terrifying weapon. And then there's the nickname that followed her, the Hyena of Auschwitz. Hyenas, after all, laugh while tearing prey apart, their beauty, or ugliness, depending on how you see it, twisting into something grotesque. The comparison stuck because it fit so well. Her laugh, her smile, her youth, they all seemed wrong in the setting of Auschwitz, like a beautiful mask covering a nightmare. The paradox of Irma Grese was that she embodied both the ordinary and the monstrous. She was someone you might have passed in the street without a second thought, but in the camp, she became a symbol of fear. That combination, the familiar wrapped around the horrific, is what makes her story so haunting even now. And so, as you lie here listening tonight, drifting through this uneasy history, you can almost picture her on that gravel path, pressed uniform, perfect hair, whip in hand. Beauty and terror bound together in one figure. The nightmare wasn't just what she did, it was that she looked like she belonged anywhere else in the world, and yet here she was, ruling Auschwitz with cruelty and grace in equal measure. The camp wasn't just a place of guards and prisoners, it was also a place of hierarchies, rivalries, and shifting alliances, even among the SS themselves. And Irma Grese, young as she was, stepped into that world with both boldness and calculation. Among her fellow guards, she was known for her ambition. Some whispered that she tried too hard to prove herself, eager to be noticed by superiors. Others resented the attention she drew. There are stories of quarrels, petty jealousies, and sharp exchanges in the barracks after hours. In those dim-lit dormitories, with boots stacked neatly against walls and the smell of leather and tobacco heavy in the air, gossip thrived. Grese found both friends and rivals. One of the women she clashed with was Johanna Bormann, another guard, older and less striking in appearance. Prisoners recalled that the two often competed for authority and recognition, sometimes taking out their frustrations directly on those in their charge. That tension made the camp atmosphere even more unpredictable, because when guards fought for dominance, prisoners often paid the price. And then there were the men. Rumors swirled around her about supposed connections to higher-ranking officers. Her youth and appearance made her stand out in a setting where brutality was otherwise faceless. Some claimed she sought the approval of SS doctors, especially Joseph Mengele. She was said to accompany him during selections, standing nearby as he pointed left or right with a flick of his hand. For prisoners, her presence there only deepened her reputation, not just a guard, but a willing participant in something even darker. But friendships did exist, guards who looked after one another, who shared cigarettes, who joked and sang songs when the day's work was over. It's strange to imagine, a circle of young women in crisp uniforms, laughing over trivialities in the barracks, while only yards away lay the barbed wire and barracks of the condemned. That contrast, ordinary camaraderie set against extraordinary horror, was part of the surreal reality of camp life. For Grese, the friendships she cultivated were double-edged. They gave her some protection, some standing. But they also tied her to people whose names would become infamous alongside hers. When the war ended, those connections would help seal her fate. Even the prisoners noticed the way she seemed to position herself socially. Some remembered her strutting with other guards, as if parading their authority like a badge. Others recalled whispered arguments, jealousy, and envy bubbling beneath the surface. In the strange world of the camp, power wasn't just about uniforms and weapons, it was about relationships. Who you knew, who you pleased, and who you antagonized could mean the difference between climbing higher or being sidelined. Irma, sharp-eyed and ambitious, seemed to understand this instinctively. And so, as you wander through this part of her story tonight, you see not only the brutality but the human pettiness that underpinned it. Friendships and rivalries among the SS might sound like small details, but in a place like Auschwitz, they shaped daily life in ways prisoners could never escape. Irma Grese wasn't just the hyena who cracked a whip in the yard. She was also the young woman trying to rise in a grim hierarchy, surrounded by friends, rivals, and whispered rumors. Those relationships gave her power, sharpened her cruelty, and ensured that when the day of reckoning came, she would not stand alone. The name that drifts like a shadow through this part of Irma Grese's story is one you've likely heard before, Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. He walked the camp with polished boots and calm authority, his gestures precise, his smile deceptively kind. To many prisoners, his presence meant life or death, chosen with a flick of his wrist. And beside him, sometimes, stood Irma Grese. It was here that the rumors began to swirl. Prisoners whispered about the young blonde guard who followed Mengele like a shadow, carrying notes, fetching supplies, or simply observing. No one knew the exact truth, whether she was merely present or whether she actively participated, but her association was enough to deepen her fearsome reputation. The stories, passed from bunk to bunk in hushed voices at night, painted Grese as more than a guard. Some claimed she escorted selected prisoners to laboratories where experiments were carried out. Others swore she watched, indifferent, as injections were given or as twins were measured and prodded for comparison. Even if exaggerations crept into these tales, the effect was the same. To the camp, Irma Grese became a figure not only of punishment but of scientific cruelty, linked to horrors that seemed to have no bottom. You can almost imagine the atmosphere, the sterile chill of the medical block, its tiled walls faintly echoing with footsteps. Bottles of chemicals line the shelves. Notebooks filled with precise handwriting rest on desks. And in the corner, a young guard in polished boots stands, watching, waiting. She does not wield the scalpel or the syringe, but her presence alone makes the prisoners tremble. The reality, historians remind us, is hard to pin down. Records of her direct involvement in experiments are scarce, much of what we know comes from testimony after the war. Survivors remembered her name, her face, her presence. And in a place where fear magnified every action, even being seen alongside Mengele could brand her forever as complicit in the worst of it. What is clear is that Irma Grese thrived on the aura of power. Being close to the infamous doctor only enhanced her standing among guards and prisoners alike. Some said she sought it out deliberately, another rung on the ladder of authority she was always climbing. Others believed she was simply swept along by circumstance, a young woman pulled into something larger than herself. But for the prisoners, there was no such nuance. They saw only the uniform, the whip, and the company she kept. When they whispered about her in the dark, they called her crueler names than hyena. They saw her as a part of a machine that experimented on human bodies as if they were objects. And so, tonight, as you listen, you can feel the unease of those rumors settling in. Maybe she did more, maybe less, but in the haunted memory of Auschwitz, the image of Irma Grese standing beside Mengele became impossible to erase. It is one of the reasons her name, above so many others, carried the weight of infamy long after the war had ended. By late 1944, the air itself seemed heavier, different. You can sense it in the way the guards walked, less arrogant swagger, more hurried glances over their shoulders. The Nazi war machine, once rolling forward with unstoppable momentum, was beginning to sputter and stall. Rumors seeped even into the barbed wire boundaries of the camps. Prisoners whispered that the Allies had landed in France, that the Russians were pushing westward with unstoppable force. Even the SS, with their carefully trained posture, could not entirely hide their unease. Irma Grese felt this change as well. Once, she had strutted through Auschwitz with the careless confidence of someone whose power seemed untouchable. But now, the news that trickled into the camp made that confidence brittle. Whole cities reduced to rubble under Allied bombs. The German army retreating, again and again. A Reich that had once promised 1,000 years already cracking apart within 12. And the camps themselves began to shift. Orders arrived to destroy evidence, records burned, buildings dismantled, prisoners sent marching west to keep them out of Allied hands. It was chaos disguised as order. Greece, still young, still ambitious, was swept along in these currents. She was transferred, like many other guards, to another camp, Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany. There, the chaos reached a fever pitch. Bergen-Belsen was never designed to hold the numbers it received in those final months. Starving prisoners were crammed into every available space, diseases like typhus raged unchecked, and food supplies dwindled to nothing. You walk through this camp in your imagination now, mud sucking at your boots, a stench in the air that clings to your clothes and refuses to leave. Guards stand at the perimeter, but even they look weary, their uniforms disheveled, their discipline breaking down. Greece's reputation did not soften in this environment. Survivors described her at Bergen-Belsen as she had been before, still striking in appearance, still merciless in behavior, still carrying her whip. But the balance of power was shifting, and perhaps she felt it. For the first time, the aura of invincibility that surrounded the SS cracked. The guards themselves began to fear capture, trial, and punishment. Here is the strange irony: even as Germany's grip collapsed, some guards clung even harder to their cruelty, as if doubling down could preserve their authority. Greece was remembered in this way, her voice sharp, her punishment sudden, her presence still terrifying. Yet the wider war was already leaving her behind. Historians still argue whether she fully understood what was coming. Did she imagine the Reich recovering? Did she believe in some miraculous German victory? Or did she, like so many, simply refuse to face the inevitability of defeat? Whatever the truth, the end was approaching faster than she could control. Picture the camp in April 1945, skeletal figures stumbling about, guards tense and exhausted, the sound of artillery faintly in the distance. Liberation was not just a rumor anymore, it was a certainty. And for Irma Grese, the moment of reckoning was drawing closer with every passing hour. The end came quietly, almost without resistance. It was April 1945 when British troops reached Bergen-Belsen. You imagine the scene, soldiers stepping cautiously through the gates, rifles raised, only to be met not by gunfire, but by silence. Inside, they found horror, thousands of corpses left unburied, the living so emaciated they seemed like ghosts. The stench was overwhelming, the kind of smell that etched itself into memory forever. And among those ghosts and those guards stood Irma Grese. She did not flee. She did not disguise herself. At just 21 years old, she still wore the neat uniform of an SS guard, as if discipline might somehow protect her from what was coming. British soldiers took her into custody almost immediately. Witnesses later recalled her demeanor, calm, composed, even smiling at times. It was a chilling contrast to the chaos all around her. The trial that followed became one of the most infamous of the post-war era, the Bergen-Belsen trial, held in Lüneburg in September 1945. You sit in the wooden gallery of that courtroom in your imagination, listening as survivor after survivor takes the stand. Their voices are quiet, often trembling, but the weight of their testimony is immense. They speak of whippings, of dogs unleashed on prisoners, of selections for the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Again and again, Irma Grese's name surfaces. She sits in the dock alongside dozens of other defendants, male guards, female overseers, even the camp commandant himself. But Grese stands out. Reporters remark on her youth, her blonde hair, her striking features. Some call her the blonde beast. Others, the hyena of Auschwitz. The nicknames swirl like smoke in the air, each one painting her as both monstrous and strangely theatrical. When asked to defend herself, Grese shows little remorse. She insists she was only following orders, that she had no real power to change anything. Yet witnesses describe her whip, her cruelty, her enjoyment of violence. The contrast is stark, and it becomes harder and harder for anyone in the courtroom to believe her denials. The British officers presiding over the trial are stern, deliberate. They weigh the evidence carefully, but the pattern is undeniable. Greece's authority at Auschwitz and later at Bergen-Belsen was real. Her actions were not accidents. The testimonies echo through the chamber, and each one is another stone laid in the wall of her guilt. By December 1945, the verdict is delivered. Grese is found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death. She does not collapse. She does not cry. Reports say she accepted her sentence with the same unsettling calm she had shown throughout the trial. Perhaps she thought defiance would shield her legacy. Perhaps she simply could not imagine a different ending. You leave the courtroom slowly, the wooden benches creaking behind you. Outside, the winter air bites at your skin. Inside, the memory of her trial lingers, an eerie blend of youthful face and unimaginable cruelty. The world has passed judgment, and now only the final act remains. It is just before dawn, December 13, 1945. The prison at Hamelin is quiet, its old stone walls holding a heavy silence. In one narrow cell, Irma Grese stirs. She is only 22 years old, though the world now knows her by names far older and darker, the Hyena of Auschwitz, the blonde beast. Outside her door, guards wait. The appointed hour has come. You follow the sound of boots echoing down the corridor. The British executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, is already prepared. Efficient, calm, and precise, he has performed this duty many times before. For him, it is not a spectacle but a job, one carried out with the swiftness of ritual. The door opens. Irma steps forward. She wears a plain prison dress, her blonde hair brushed neatly back. Observers would later say that she looked composed, almost serene. No tears. No trembling. Only the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips, as though she were determined to face death with defiance. The walk is short, perhaps only a dozen steps, yet in your mind it stretches endlessly. The corridor seems colder with each pace. Onlookers watch from the shadows, their breath fogging in the winter air. Some whisper about the crimes she committed, the hundreds of lives scarred or ended under her watch. Others remain silent, unwilling to break the stillness of the moment. At the foot of the scaffold, Pierrepoint gives quiet instructions. Irma climbs the wooden steps without hesitation. The rope hangs ready, stark against the dim light of the chamber. She stands beneath it, her head high, her eyes forward. When asked for her final words, she speaks them clearly, in German. Schnell. Quick. It is not a plea, but a command, perhaps the last echo of the authority she once held in the camps. The hood is lowered. The rope is set. In that breath between stillness and the fall, you realize how young she is, just a girl, scarcely out of her teens, yet already a symbol of cruelty, fear, and war. And then, with one swift movement, it ends. For those watching, there is no triumph, only a heavy silence. Justice has been carried out, but the memory of what she did, the whip, the dogs, the selections, the faces of the prisoners, lingers in the air, heavier than the rope itself. You step back into the early morning chill. Outside, the first light of dawn spreads across the sky, pale and indifferent. The world moves forward, but the story of Irma Grese remains, forever caught between the shadows of youth and the darkness of history. The cell doors have closed. The scaffold stands empty once more. Outside the prison at Hamelin, the December air is crisp, and dawn continues to stretch across the horizon. The world, as it always does, carries on. Irma Grese's life ended at just 22. It is a shocking number, an age when most people are still deciding who they wish to be, still fumbling with dreams and mistakes that shape the person they might become. But her choices had already carved a path steeped in cruelty, and history remembers her not as a young woman of promise, but as a symbol of terror. You sit quietly with the thought, listening to the hush of morning. It is tempting to ask how such an ordinary farm girl could become the Hyena of Auschwitz. Was it the indoctrination of her youth? The lure of authority in a collapsing world? Or something colder and harder within her nature? These questions linger, but they have no easy answers. For the survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, the memory of Irma Grese was not just a story, but a wound, one face among many in the machinery of cruelty. Her name was carried into testimony, into trials, and into history books, not because she was unique, but because she embodied a truth about the war, that unimaginable horrors could be carried out by people still startlingly young, still capable of laughter, still recognizably human. And so the reflection turns, as night stories often do, toward us. History is not only about remembering who lived and who died, but also about remembering how ordinary choices, multiplied across thousands, can create extraordinary suffering. Grese's life reminds us of that, in a way that is both chilling and strangely fragile. Now, as the sky brightens fully, the tale quiets. The footsteps in prison corridors fade, the rope and the scaffold blur into the mists of the past. What remains is the silence, a silence filled with memory, justice, and uneasy reflection. You exhale, slowly. Another chapter of history, dark and heavy, has been set down. The night has carried you through it, and now the morning light is here to close the page. Sleep, if you wish, knowing that the story of Irma Grese has ended. The echoes of her life remain in history's halls, but in this moment, you can let them drift away, softened by distance, carried off like mist in the first warmth of day. The story has carried you through shadows, through the echoes of gravel yards, through whispered rumors and trial chambers, and now it is time to let the tension ease. You can feel your shoulders unclench, your breath lengthen, as the images of barracks, whips, and harsh commands begin to soften in your mind. History, as dark as it can be, also teaches patience and reflection. You think of the ordinary people who survived, the small acts of courage, the kindnesses that persisted even in the smallest corners. A prisoner sharing a scrap of bread, a whispered word of comfort in the night, the faint glimmer of humanity that somehow resisted the horror, it all reminds you that even in the bleakest moments, the human spirit can endure. Now imagine the sun rising over a quiet field, not over barbed wire or smoke, but over gentle hills and open sky. The wind lifts the leaves, birds call softly, and you can almost feel the warmth of morning brushing across your skin. These are the images to hold on to as the story of cruelty fades behind the lens of memory. And you notice your heartbeat slowing, your eyelids growing heavier. The lessons of history, dark though they are, do not have to stay with you as anxiety. They can become a gentle awareness, a reminder to value compassion, empathy, and the quiet acts of decency that ripple outward into the world. You let your mind drift further. The echo of harsh voices, the whips crack, the stench of the camps, all these begin to recede, replaced by calm, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of water, the lull of a gentle breeze. Your imagination takes you somewhere warmer, safer, more ordinary. Tonight, you've walked alongside one of history's most infamous figures. You've seen both the darkness and the faint light that persisted around her. And now, with that story concluded, it is time to rest, letting the weight of memory fade, letting the quiet of night carry you gently into sleep. Sleep well, and remember, the past can teach, but the present cradles you in safety.